today, the 10th of December, it's the United Nations Human Rights Day. Well, 1986, this country ratified CEDAW. In 2004, the country signed the optional protocol to CEDAW. What we want to come into play, according to the recommendations of the President's report of the CEDAW People's Tribunal, is that this country should honour its obligations under CEDAW because of having signed and ratified that international convention. It is making a commitment to entering that law, the principles of CEDAW, into domestic law in this country. The United Kingdom has not done that yet. Very piecemeal, it's introduced legislation about equal pay, which really has not made a great deal of difference to women's income, to women's wage rights. Of course, the Equality Act of 2010 has some waving in the right direction, but it is certainly not enough. And the CEDAW committee has recognised that. Within the last few days, the CEDAW committee, that is the United Nations Committee addressing or under CEDAW, has said to the government of this country, the United Kingdom, that the United Kingdom must stop lagging behind, stop dragging its feet, and come into the 21st century. The committee has said in this letter within the last few days, sign up, honour your obligations, honour your commitment. The United Kingdom is not entitled to ratify CEDAW, having signed it several years before, and then simply sit there not implementing it, not introducing it into domestic law. So the principal recommendation of the President's report from the CEDAW People's Tribunal is that this country, the United Kingdom, must introduce a Women's Bill of Rights. That Women's Bill of Rights must incorporate every principle, every provision of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That Women's Bill of Rights must also incorporate the updates that have come since 1979, when the original convention was drafted, all the updates that the CEDAW committee has made in its deliberations on the operation and the application of CEDAW. The women of this country are entitled to a Women's Bill of Rights. If the United Kingdom Parliament lags in its obligation to do that, it will find itself pushed to one side by the devolved authorities of Scotland and Wales, which are already on their way to introducing bills of rights, women's bills of rights, so that the women in Scotland and the women in Wales can have the protection and the advantage and the advancement that would accrue to women under domestic law framed in CEDAW. This is the principal proposal, the principal recommendation of the tribunal, that a Women's Bill of Rights be introduced domestically into the law of this country to cover England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Under the recommendations of the President's report, if the United Kingdom Parliament does, as it is obliged to do, introduce a Women's Bill of Rights, then that would not preclude Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland from doing so also, though they would have to be consistent with the United Kingdom principles, the CEDAW principles, because there are other nations that also have states or provinces or lands where there are domestic laws that cover women's rights as human rights, and they operate alongside the national law, not overturning it, but operating in accordance, for example, with entities that are registered within that jurisdiction alone. And there is no problem with having a United Kingdom Women's Bill of Rights and working alongside that United Kingdom Women's Bill of Rights, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland also having their own legislation covering women's rights as human rights, but they cannot derogate from the principles of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, with all its updates, because they could not bring in legislation that undercut women's rights that are written into a Women's Bill of Rights that is the United Kingdom Bill of Rights. Now, that of course is not enough, because what we know and what we learned through the CEDAW People's Tribunal hearings is something that's sadly extremely obvious, and that is there is a desperate need for education of the judiciary, education of lawyers, whether they're practicing as barristers, as solicitors, whether they're working in the academic sphere. Too few acknowledge and recognise the principles and the practices required under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Some of them, I hasten to say, although I'd prefer not to be in a position of having to do so, too many of them don't even know that CEDAW exists. And yet they sit on courts throughout this nation, throughout the United Kingdom, pronouncing on issues relating to the law, of course, and not being aware that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. Therefore, one of the major recommendations of the President's report is that they all need to be educated. It must include a provision which says that it is mandatory for members of the judiciary and the magistracy at all levels to receive education and training on an initial and regular basis about what these rights are, what women's rights are, what the women's rights are that are human rights that accrue to women and to which women are entitled. This is dealing with centuries of undermining women, not regarding women as human, considering that women are not persons, and denying human rights to women. It must be mandatory training, it must be initial training, it must be regular training. But we're not going to stop at the magistracy, the judiciary, and the practicing profession. Every member of Parliament must undergo training and education in women's rights as human rights and human rights as women's rights. If there are members of Parliament in the United Kingdom Parliament or in the devolved assemblies who are pronouncing upon legislation, who are saying yay or nay, who are going into committees and proposing amendments to legislation, or if they're going about their constituency business and they do not know about the principles that need to be addressed and recognised and acknowledged fully in terms of women's rights, then they can't be equipped to do their job as representatives of the people. Therefore, there must be mandatory education and training for members of Parliament. And we're not stopping there. Those who seek to represent the community in any elected office, for example, as local councillors, they too require this training. And therefore, this is an essential element, an essential recommendation of the President's report arising out of the CEDAW People's Tribunal. There are other matters, of course, in relation to this Women's Bill of Rights, because in the hearings that were before the People's Tribunal, the hearings of the 21st, 22nd and 23rd of June in the year 2021, many experts in their field, women and some men, appeared giving evidence about being in practice and appearing in courts or tribunals, or working in research positions or in academia, or working at the grassroots level in women's services. And every one of these women and the few men who appeared who care about women's rights, every one of them, out of their expertise, out of their practical work, out of their academic work, out of their theoretical work, were cognizant of faults in the system that demand rectification. Members of the judiciary for years and years brought down decisions in the 19th century into the 20th century saying women were not persons. And this wrong has been carried through the law in many ways. Women are now regarded as persons. A decision of the Privy Council in 1929 decided that, but it took a very long time for that to come about. Now, just to wrap up on a very quick note as to some issues also that are the subject of recommendations going along with the principal recommendation, which is a Women's Bill of Rights. There are many issues where the law does not work. And it doesn't work because it hasn't been written in language that actually recognises what the issues are that it should cover, number one. And number two, it hasn't been interpreted in a way that was intended to acknowledge and affirm women's rights. One of the problems with the Crown Prosecution Service that needs to be addressed too is that when it comes to cases that are dropped or simply just not proceeded with, what are the major areas of law, of allegations of crime where that happens? It's flashing, it's criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence, and it's rape. Those are the three areas where the most dropping of prosecutions occurs. And the final point on this I'd like to make is that of terminology and language. And the President's report does make it clear that language is important. Glanville Williams, the doyen of the law from the University of Cambridge, once made the point that language is powerful, and the most powerful language is the language of the law. Let me say that there are many more recommendations in the President's report of the CEDAW People's Tribunal. What we need to acknowledge here is that if we are to get a Women's Bill of Rights to address equal pay, to address the pensions issue, women who've been deprived of their pensions, to address rape law reform, to address all those issues that are part and parcel of CEDAW, the recognition and acknowledgement of minority women's rights, Black and minoritized women, that Black and minoritized women are equally entitled to all the rights that men have, just as women who are not in the Black and minoritized category have an entitlement to recognition of all the rights that men have. What we need to do is remember that Black and minoritized women are denied their rights on this basis of being a woman and being from a Black and minoritized community. And that is absolutely essential to be recognised, the failures of the system there. We need this Women's Bill of Rights, and the way that we will get it is by demanding it of our government, demanding it of our members of parliament, and doing this by signing a petition, the link to which will be at the foot of this video. And I'm ending now on this note with a call to action. And the call to action is to all of us as women, and to those men who recognise injustice when it stares them in the face, as some men do, and that's why we have the right to vote. And there are men in the community who recognise that without a Women's Bill of Rights, the injustices to women will continue. So our voice must be heard through this petition, through our lobbying of members of parliament, and ultimately the demand must be made, and the demand is made to government. To Mr. Prime Minister, if you actually have any real consideration for the women of the United Kingdom, you will immediately instruct Parliamentary Council to work together with CEDAW in law, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination in law, the committee which is behind the People's Tribunal, the Parliamentary Council to work together with these women and men experts in order to draw up the Women's Bill of Rights, and then to present it to Parliament and take it through the Parliament, with every member of your political party supporting it. And with every member, we demand of the opposition parties that they must support the Women's Bill of Rights too. So you can make your decision, Prime Minister. You can ignore this, and you can be left with your feet behind in the dust, because the world is moving in this direction. The CEDAW committee has demanded in the last few days that the United Kingdom government act. We demand, as the CEDAW People's Tribunal, that you act. And if you don't act, Scotland and Wales will be ahead of you. But if you care about your position on the world stage, then we say, act now. A Women's Bill of Rights, women's rights are human rights are women's rights, and the women's rights, the human rights, need to be acknowledged, confirmed, and passed through the United Kingdom Parliament as a Women's Bill of Rights. Thank you.